Welcome to this AU Press's sponsored webinar, Interviewing Best Practices, Tips from University Professionals. This session is being sponsored by Jack Farrell & Associates Executive Search Firm. This session will begin shortly and will conclude at 3 p.m. Eastern. Just a friendly reminder that the session is being recorded and the recording will be sent to attendees within a few days. Also, captioning is available for the session. To enable, please click on the closed captioning button located at the bottom of your screen. The chat box has been disabled. Please type your questions into the Q&A box located in the lower portion of your screen. Our presenters will answer questions towards the end of the session. With that, I will turn it over to Nicole.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for the Interviewing Best Practices webinar. I'm Nicole Solano. I'm an executive editor at Rutgers University Press and co-chair of the Professional Development Committee. The Professional Development Committee's charge is to develop and manage tools, programs, and resources to assist AU Press's members in improving their publishing expertise, developing leadership skills, and enhancing their professional development. And we've jointly organized today's session with Paths in Publishing. And Paths in Publishing is a free mentorship program to help prepare early career applicants. That's those who are moving into or out of entry-level jobs and the work of applying to, interviewing for, and navigating negotiations for new positions in scholarly publishing. And PIP mentors believe that the process of applying and interviewing for jobs are skills that can be practiced and with guidance made less stressful and more productive. And I know Alexis just mentioned it, but a quick thank you to Jack Farrell & Associates for sponsoring today's webinar. Because of their sponsorship, we were able to offer it without charging attendees, which is great. And thank you also to Alexis for help with getting everything set up and answering my many, many questions along the way. The subject of today's webinar is the interviewing process, best practices, and we'll be answering some questions that people may otherwise either not know who to ask or just not feel comfortable asking. And we have some very thoughtful and experienced speakers. We're going to discuss some of the best practices for preparing for interviews, aspects of the interview itself, as well as the post-interview sort of follow-up process and best practices. This session is a follow-up to last month's session on resumes and cover letters, which some of you may have attended as well. And so we're gonna probably speak for 20 to 30 minutes or so, and then use the remaining 30 or so minutes to answer any Q&A that people may have shared in the chat box. Registrants did have the opportunity to post questions ahead of the session. So we're going to kind of address those in the various portions of the sort of interview process that we're discussing now. But please feel free to submit any additional questions while we're speaking, and we'll get to those at the end as well. And to kick things off, I'm just going to ask our presenters who have experience on both sides of the interviewing table to give a brief intro, talk about their current position and career trajectory, and we will start things off with Kate Danser.
Okay. Thanks, Nicole. So as Nicole said, I'm Kate Danser. I currently work in HR at Princeton University Press. I've been here for about 5 years. This is my first job in publishing. Previously, I worked for a social policy research firm, but also HR. So I have about 20 years of experience in HR. As probably all of you know, HR has a lot of different areas like benefits, professional development. While I currently have experience in all those areas, I started out as a recruiting assistant. So my foundation is in recruiting. I have looked at a lot of resumes, cover letters. I've talked to hundreds of candidates. So I come to this with a lot of exposure. I've seen how recruiting can be done well. I've also seen how it can not be done well. And I have really oriented myself to cultivate a positive candidate experience with an E&I angle. I really want to help make HR less opaque and specifically provide an inside baseball perspective to help equalize and remove barriers that can at times exist with the recruiting process, whether it's intentional or not by employers. So I'm pleased to be part of the panel today, and I'm going to turn over my colleague, Michelle, to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Michelle Komie. I'm publisher for art and architecture at Princeton University Press. And my first job out of college was working for someone who I had for whom I had been a work study student. So that was a job I didn't have to interview for. The job after that was back at Washington University for a department that I'd done some freelance work for. I did have to interview for that job, but I already knew them and I knew the work that they did. And I was there for 3 years. And then the big jump that I made was when I started as an editorial assistant at Yale University Press in 2001. And I had to fly myself out for an in-person interview and was really very nervous and had never been in a publisher before. Wasn't sure how it was going to happen. There was a lot of pressure because I'd just flown in. But that worked out. And thankfully, and I was at Yale for 13 years before moving to Princeton in 2014. And even though Princeton was a peer press, and I knew the press very well, I did not know the people I was going to be interviewing with. And again, I was nervous. So, and I've been at Princeton for 8 years. So that is my history of interviews and nervousness. And we'll move on to Rachael.
Hi, I'm Rachael Levay. I currently work as the editor-in-chief at the University Press of Colorado, and I also acquire for the Utah State University Press imprints. And I started out in publishing in 2006 as a publicist at the University of Washington Press. My qualifications getting me to that point were sparse. I had worked in an independent bookstore in the Seattle area, coordinating marketing and events for author events primarily, and had taken some editing and publishing courses in my MFA program. I worked as a publicist for a few years and then was promoted to sales manager at UW Press, and then eventually was the marketing and sales director there before transitioning to the University Press of Colorado as an acquisitions editor in 2017. And I just this year became editor-in-chief, and am also involved in some other AU Presses work. I'm on the AU Presses board of directors this year, and am one of the co-founders with my colleague Allegra Marchenko of Passon Publishing. So I will hand things over to Emily.
Hi, everybody. So I'm a little bit newer than Rachael and Michelle, but I have actually worked at university presses for all of my jobs since college. I was very, very committed while I was in college to only working in book publishing. Like, I always knew that that's what I wanted to do. So I interned at any place that I could, find, literary agency, cookbook publisher, university press. And then my first job out of college was at Cornell University Press, and I was an acquisitions assistant. And I was assisting 3 different editors, I think, and it was a really amazing kind of intro into the university press publishing world. And I loved it, and I got to work on so many different books. But I started getting really interested in social media and being on sort of like the more external side of things and going to conferences and talking to people about our books. And that was all really exciting. So some of my colleagues very graciously let me kind of do some experimenting on the marketing side at Cornell. Like, I started our Instagram account and kind of got my feet wet in the marketing side of things. And then I decided I want to move back to Boston, where I'm originally from. So I started looking at marketing, publishing jobs, and I was hired at Beacon Press, where I still currently work. So I was hired, I think, as an associate marketing manager, and I'm now senior marketing manager at Beacon. So I've been there for about 6 years, I think. But yeah, it's been wonderful. So I've run the internship program when I was at Cornell and now at Beacon. So I'm very familiar with sort of being on that side of the interviewing process, hiring committees. And then I've obviously interviewed for many, many jobs, some that I got, some that I didn't get. But yeah, that's sort of like an overview of my experience. And then I think I'm actually going to kick things off by starting to talk about prior to the interview and sort of things that you can do to research and prepare. And so I think for so many of us that work in publishing or want careers in media or editorial or anything like that, one of our big strengths is researching skills and like attention to detail. So this is where that really comes in handy. And so basically, I've done every kind of Googling imaginable when I'm going into an interview, or really before that, when I'm writing my cover letter. I might go a little overboard, but I will try to look on LinkedIn to see if I can find who held that position before. I'll Google, names of other people in the department, see if they've ever written anything about their work online. Like I know at Beacon, we have sort of a behind the scenes series on our blog that kind of where people talk about what they do and how they got in publishing. And that can be really helpful too. And I just usually make a Google Doc where I put all of this, these tidbits in. And obviously we're not going to bring up a lot of this background info in the interview, but it's just really helpful, I think, to get as much background as you can about the culture, the people that work there, if people are leaving, if people are staying for a very long time. I think in the digital age, there are usually a lot of breadcrumbs that you can find that tell you, that might help to tell you something about a particular office, culture or department, and publishing specific. I kind of hope this goes without saying for many of you, but this is also going to mean getting really familiar with the types of books that the press publishes, and being prepared to talk about certain disciplines or even certain titles in the interview. One of the things that I always ask in interviews is what types of titles in particular that we publish that people are interested in or that they're excited about. And when people can't name any specific genre or title or anything like that, that's always sort of a red flag for me that maybe someone wasn't super committed to our press specifically or hadn't done a lot of research beforehand. So I always think that it's great to pick a few specific titles and make sure you're familiar with them or that you have some questions kind of prepared to ask about the books. And before I go I just wanted to say to all of the other panelists that you can feel free to jump in if you have anything to add. That's how we'll be kind of going throughout the different timelines of the interview. But yeah, another great resource I always find is the press website to see what they're posting about. It's great to pick a couple of, genres and kind of read any catalogs that are on the press website, just see what titles are getting a lot of attention. If you have an Edelweiss account or something like that, you can look at past publisher catalogs or things like that, which are a great source of information. And then I always also check out all of the publishers' social media accounts, including blogs or LinkedIn link their LinkedIn page to see if there's any big events that happened recently or anything particularly newsworthy that you can kind of just have as background information or to ask questions about in the interview. And yeah, so research is super important. Obviously, you're not going to get the job because you did a lot of research. The important thing is your credentials, what you bring to the table, what if you're a good fit for the organization. But I like to be, as prepared as I possibly can and think of ways that I can connect the skills and interests that I have to things that I know that the press has a certain strength in or that would help me in the position. And so just in terms of preparing questions and things like that, what I try to do typically, imagine if I were hiring for the role, what questions I would want to ask, what I would want to know about that person. And I write everything down or type it out in my brainstorming, because I think that that helps you to sort of really think through exactly what your answer would be if you have a couple of anecdotes or stories about particular strengths that you have, or if there was a time that you went above and beyond to help an author. Just really writing that out and seeing it and figuring out ways that you can connect it to other questions that the interviewer might ask. I think that's always helpful to have a couple of great stories sort of in your back pocket, and that you've thought about ways that you can slide that in, even if the interviewer is not asking about one specific story, just figuring out ways that you can kind of integrate those into different questions. Yeah, and so being prepared with examples of your own work, I think, is very important. And because, yeah, if you have, I think it's these really clear, specific examples of the things that you've been successful in your past job. If you have any sort of numbers or yeah, just being as specific as you can, I think, is really helpful to people, and shows that you know what you're talking about and know what the responsibilities of this potential job might entail, more than just saying something like, I'm a really hard worker. You know, if you can back that up with quantifiable data to sort of say why that's true. And then something that I've always done is I look over my resume and cover letter and come up with any potential shortcomings or things that a person might want to address in an interview. For example, like if there's a gap in your resume, or if you're switching from departments and you haven't held a position in marketing before or something like that. Try to identify any kind of misgivings or questions someone might have about you as a candidate, and come up with reasons of either why that's a strength, or explain what was going on, or just have, yeah, kind of in advance prepare a statement about that, and just so it is very clear to everybody that you could say, like, I know that I have not worked in a marketing department before, but I have all this informal experience at my previous job where I helped different people in the department at their with their marketing tasks, and here's some examples of social media images I've created and XYZ, just to show that you're you know, aware that there is a potential gap or potential someone could see it as a shortcoming. I always like to kind of figure out what that might be, so I can address that beforehand. And we did get a couple of questions about switching positions when you're moving from one department to another, and I can speak a little bit about that, since I went from acquisitions and then made the switch to marketing at a different press. And so what I did was really, in the interview and in my cover letter, really emphasize the work that I had already done in my position, and then brought in examples. I had a lot of printouts of things that I'd done, campaigns, and because I was able to show kind of all that experience, even though my job title wasn't in marketing, I think that was helpful. And just one last tip, this is kind of a long-term tip, but if you know that you want to switch departments kind of further down the road, and you work in publishing now, or you work in some sort of job where someone does something that you're a little bit more interested in and think you want to do that down the road, ask them, see if there's anything that you can do to help them. Maybe, usually everyone's really busy, and if there is something kind of basic that they would be willing to give you to sort of do, usually that's helpful for them, and you get to kind of add things to your resume that you might not have done or in your own position. So you might be taking on a little bit of extra work in the short term, but I think it's really worth it if you know what you want to transition into, even if you can just have conversations with someone, yeah, and just get feedback and advice. That's super helpful.
That's a fantastic tip. And I think it can be something as simple as asking to attend a meeting that you would not otherwise attend if you're interested in production or editing or marketing. Go to a colleague in that department and say, this is so interesting. I'd love to learn more about it. Can I sit in on a couple of meetings? And it's a great way to kind of refresh your vocabulary and um, broaden your experience. And so then down the line, you can, if you happen to find yourself in an interview for a job that's in that field, you can say, but I did attend these meetings and it was so interesting. And I was particularly excited about this, and this, and I learned these two things. And you don't have to have done that job. You don't have to have interned in that area, but it shows some familiarity and that you have a sense of what you're getting into.
Yeah, I also wanted to chime in a bit. I worked in marketing and sales for, I can't quite do that math, but more than 10 years before transitioning into acquisitions. And I was fortunate at my press in that there were a number of acquisitions editors who had previously worked in marketing. And so we collaborated often. And I really looked for opportunities to engage with the acquisitions process. I think, like a lot of us, acquisitions was always something I was interested in, and I just happened to land in marketing. So I did kind of take a long game on that transition and really spent a couple of years looking at the memos and the documents that were coming from that department, offering to give early marketing tips on manuscripts that were coming through the acquisitions pipeline. Because at Washington, marketing handled blurbs, I also spent a lot of time in the peer review reports and kind of looking at how the peer review process unfolded and how acquisitions editors engaged with that process in transitioning those reviews back to their editors and seeking revisions, and kind of compiled a lot of that work over time to kind of be in my bank of knowledge when the time came to make that transition. I did
Yeah,
also,
if you wanted to jump in, Rachel, that was all.
oh yeah, I was going to talk a little bit too about questions that you can ask during the interview process, because I've certainly been in interviews where the whole tenor of the interview changes either positively or negatively based on the questions that an interviewee brings to the table. And so I tend to kind of think that there's like three categories of questions that you can ask, like questions that you could probably just avoid, questions that are going to be really out of the box and generative for the conversation, and then questions that you should maybe consider asking if the information hasn't been volunteered by the interviewers. So in thinking about questions to maybe avoid, I think some of those sorts of really standard ones, like what does success look like in this job? Because that you probably are going to have that information from the job ad itself. It's going to be related to metrics and things that are going to be evident as you prepare for the position. I think a lot of the questions that I've been asked in interviews that have been really out of the box and productive have tended to be questions about like the structure of the organization. What are your processes like for books? Like, how are books approved? What is your peer review process like if you're applying for an acquisitions job? Even what is the workflow for a title through the press, because it'll give you a lot more information about how the departments work together and what the kind of the overlaps are and gaps in the workflow across departments. I often really like when people ask what are communications like between the departments, because it gives you a chance to kind of open up beyond that specific position and talk about your colleagues a bit. I also really love when people ask, what are your favorite books that have been published by your press over the last, 5, 10, 15 years? And then I also like when folks ask questions like, what directions do you want to see this position move into? Like, what are the opportunities to kind of grow the position or shift the position in larger ways? I also think that there's sort of standard questions that interviewers should give you answers to without your asking the question. But if they don't, you can feel free to ask those questions like, what is your timeline for the hire? Do you have a start date in mind? Those are totally fair questions to ask if if the information hasn't been volunteered. And I also think if you are BIPOC, LGBTQ, disabled, you can consider asking questions like, how many marginalized staff are at the press, and what has the retention and promotion processes been like for those staff? And you can also ask to be connected with those staff for conversations outside of the interview space as well. And I think that's important to consider.
Those were, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh,
Go
sorry,
ahead,
Michelle.
Kate.
Can I just
No,
add
no.
one more thing before we switch to the during the interview? So just something that I know employers can be variable in how much they help you prepare, like your expectations of what the interview, like what's the format, like why am I meeting, how are the people that I'm meeting with related to the job that I'm interviewing for? Those are things that I do preparing candidates, but not all employers do that. It is okay to ask them. I've been asked, what should I wear? It's okay to ask those type of questions. Anything that's going to help you feel prepared, it is okay to, besides doing your own research, which is a lot of what was discussed, it is okay to go back to the employer in preparation with anything, any insight they might be able to give you to help you manage your expectations for the actual interview.
Go ahead,
I
Rachel.
was just really quickly, I was going to say, if there are interviewers in the audience, also maybe consider sharing your questions for first round interviews in advance, because that's a really great thing to do. And I know I'm speaking to interviewers, not interviewees, but it's my pitch.
I've already learned so much. This is so interesting and helpful. And I wanted to open up by noting that when I talk to authors about if I'm doing a publishing talk and explaining the publishing process, I always begin by saying I'm coming from the press that I work for, and I'm a certain kind of editor, and this is how I work. And not every single editor is going to be the same. Not every press is the same. And I think that applies to this conversation as well, that there are going to be variances here depending on whether the press that you're applying to has an HR department. How does that department work? Are they a part of a university and you're going through the university's HR department, and maybe that HR person isn't a staff member at the press? How big is the staff? The level of job you're applying for and the level of detail and information you should be expected to discuss as a result. But I think in general, these are really, really helpful best practices. And there are certain things that apply really across the board. So we have this Q&A function here, and people should feel free to please use it, including commenting on your own experience. And in any case, another thing that I say to authors is that if they're stressed out about the proposal, they're really worried, what are the elements of the proposal? How do I submit them? I always say, listen, just do your best. Here are the guidelines. If you're missing something, if the book seems like a good fit, we're always going to follow up. And I think a lot of candidates go into interviews feeling like the burden is really on them to do a good job. And it is a two-part conversation. The interview is a conversation. At its best, it should feel like a conversation, that it's flowing, that there's back and forth, that you as the candidate are also asking for information that you need to decide whether this place is a good fit for you. So all that is to say that if something is missing, or you don't ask the right question, or something, there's one of these details that doesn't get checked off the list, if during the course of the interview that the person you're speaking with feels like it's the right fit, it's going to be okay. And but the burden is also on the interviewer to make sure you feel comfortable, to see if you have any questions, to help you through what is, everybody knows it's a nervous making process. Like if it feels better when you sit down to say I'm nervous, you don't even have to, because everybody has been interviewed. Everybody remembers that it makes you nervous, no matter what level, what kind of job you're applying for. It's a tough thing, and we don't do it very often. It's a conversation with this big formal title, and that changes things. So I think the goal is to get there, to sit down and kind of get beyond the term interview as soon as you possibly can, while answering the questions for both people. Another thing to note is that we could and probably should have another panel for interviewers because interviewers come to interviews with a wide range of skills and training and preparation. And I've certainly gone into interviews relatively cold, and I've gone into interviews feeling very, very prepared. I'm very lucky that I get to work with Kate Danser, who's great about coaching people on how to perform an effective interview. But there is a lot of personality involved and a lot of kind of comfort, both communicating comfort on the part of the interviewer and eventually trying to feel comfortable if you're being interviewed. So in any case, some interviewers will prep in advance, others will walk in holding your resume. Hopefully that won't happen, but it can, and they're just going to kind of wing it. And so there's a little bit, I think, for the interviewee of taking a deep breath, thinking on your feet. If you've taken Emily's and Rachel's great advice about prepping, it will be so much easier. You will feel so much confident. Feeling prepared is a huge factor in how you feel in the interview and what you're able to convey, the level of enthusiasm and confidence and comfort that you're able to communicate, and which will make having a conversation that much easier. So another thing you should know going in is how much time you have. Or is this do you have a 15-minute window, or do you have a half-hour window, or are you going to be there for an hour? Because that will really help you think through how detailed you need to be, the length of the anecdotes or narrative you can provide, or really if this is a very quick shot and you're going to maybe kind of try to hit one or two things and then you're moving on to the next person. And you should have a proper, schedule for what's happening when, who you're meeting with, at what time. You should know who everybody is. There shouldn't be any huge surprises coming at you during an interview. And that, again, it's the responsibility of the interviewer to make sure that's clear. Let's see. So again, the interviewer will have your CV and your resume. And often in an interview, while they are most likely looking for more details, the kinds of things that you can't really include in a short description of your job, they're also looking for a sense of your personality, what it will be like to work with you. And you shouldn't feel shy about expressing that unless you are a shy person, in which case that's fine. It's absolutely fine to be shy and be yourself. And you don't have to, the best interviews are when you're feeling authentic and honest, and you're not pretending. You don't feel as though you are pretending to take on a character that isn't actually yours. You want to quantify wherever it seems appropriate. So if someone is asking you a specific question about your resume, which often happens, tell me more about your work in this department. You should feel confident kind of jumping in and giving some specific examples. So did you begin by working with 5 authors, and over the year and a half you were there, grew your responsibilities to working with more authors, or shifting and taking on, more data maintenance, something that tells a little bit of a story, that you're describing your job, but you're also telling something about yourself. You can also mention what you really enjoyed about that work. That's always really helpful for an interviewer to hear. Publishing is a very small world, particularly if you're applying within your press or from one press to another. And you can assume that people, if they aren't close personal friends, they know people. And you always want to appear positive about your current job. So it may be that you're leaving because you haven't enjoyed the work, or there's something about it that's causing you to move elsewhere. But in general, it's a good idea to just be very generally positive about the place that you've worked. And if someone asks you a specific question that that touches on something else, it's fine. You know, if someone says, why are you leaving your current job? Which I don't think people would really ever ask. That would be kind of a very bad interviewer question. But well, maybe not. Kate, what do you think? Kate's making an interesting face. You think that's a fair interview question?
I think the way I would phrase, it's okay to be curious about, but the way I would phrase it is why you're looking for new opportunities.
Yeah.
Not talking about the prior job, but why, yeah, what they're looking for future, like forward thinking.
Yeah. So that's a great place to talk about your ambition, your desire to grow your responsibilities. Maybe your interests have changed, but to keep the conversation focused on the type of work and not about the people that you've been working with so much. That gets a little touchy and a little bit personal. I don't think that's probably not a surprise to a lot of people. We got a couple really good questions from the group, from people who are attending. Are there any questions that you shouldn't ask? I think, you know, one thing that you want it to be, you have a limited amount of time, and so you really want things to be helpful in an interview. And one thing to do is to be very clear if you have kind of HR related questions about salary and timeline and benefits, but you're interviewing with the hiring manager and those are two different people, you can ask you can ask the hiring manager, I have questions about these things. Should I speak to the HR manager, or who's the best person for me to address those questions to? And maybe the interviewer will know the answers, or they might say, oh, that's great. Yeah, you should talk to this person. At the end of the day, you'll be meeting with him or her. How to be memorable. I think that's a lovely thing to ask. And I am increasingly seeing people add information about their hobbies and interests on their resumes, which I don't think was done as much when I was applying for jobs, but it's a really nice way to provide some personal information so that just to with the potential of initiating a larger conversation, or to get more into the conversation space and less and away from the kind of question and answer volley that an interview can somehow feel like. You certainly don't have to. I think being enthusiastic and being prepared and feeling confident yourself, those are all also really wonderful ways to be memorable, and probably the best way. But sometimes people say, tell me a little bit about yourself, and you know, having a personal interest or something to throw in there is not a bad idea. It's not required, but I would be interested to know what other people think about that. I thought it was a nice question. How to be memorable in an interview.
Can I go back to the first part of that, Michelle, which was the questions not to ask?
Sure, yeah.
Just want to kind of remind folks that you are giving insight to the folks that you're interviewing with, things that are important to you based on the questions that you ask, and also how much you're grasping the information that they've conveyed. So a very common example that I often hear is, you know, here at PUP, an editorial assistant, they're not going to acquire right away. And we're very clear about that. And we hope that people grasp that through the conversations, but you'll get questions of how soon can I acquire? And you're demonstrating your ability to intake new information, apply it in the moment. And so you should be agile with the questions that you might have had prepared. So just something to consider. And then another question that I've gotten before that I will tell you that makes me really uncomfortable, that I think people have found online, is to ask, is there anything about my qualifications that concerns you? That's, you know, if most people are not going to answer that directly, that's incredibly awkward, particularly at that stage. So like those type of questions are super direct and put people in an awkward spot. I would highly recommend, if that's not obvious.
I just wanted to say we've gotten a few questions now in the chat box. So I think it might be good if we have Kate kind of talk about some of her thoughts on best practices for after the interview, and then we will have maybe 15 minutes or so to kind of go over some of the newer questions that were posted.
Great. Thanks, Nicole. So the last kind of phase is negotiations or post-interview. And so number one, post-interview, don't feel like it's over. So there's times where it's just like, we don't hear from candidates again. This is your opportunity. The question about how do I remain memorable, right? So it's not just being memorable in the interview, it's remain memorable. So please do send a thank you note. And there's like good quality thank you notes, and then there's kind of not so great ones. The not so great ones are just thank you for meeting with me, kind of very generic, versus the really specific, tailoring it for each interviewer. We do all talk, and we do know if you sent us all the same thank you email, really capturing kind of what was interesting, talking to that person, what you walked away with. That always goes a really long way, tailoring the thank you notes. I think, that said, I don't ever think that is a like a total ding against people if you don't send a thank you note. It's just having manners and just being, following up and then keeping yourself memorable, because we are, everybody's always considering multiple candidates. So as far as negotiations, so you get to the point that you get an offer, focus on evidence-based negotiations, not emotionally based. So, do your research, just as we've talked about before. Typically a good employer will be giving you at least, hopefully, the base salary. You'll have an understanding of how compensation is formed for that organization. Make sure you kind of go in with evidence of why you're negotiating, why you want to negotiate to said number. And also focus on total rewards. Salary is just one component of the offer. This is your opportunity to negotiate. And I will tell you, that is a lot of times people miss that, of like, oh, they get here and they're like, I really wish I had more PTO. Doing it when you're a candidate, I will tell you, you have more leverage often than when you are already there, because you can say, oh, at my current job, I already received this amount of PTO. I would really like to stay at that level. So think holistically, really about what you can negotiate. Get creative. I've seen people where like they have student loans that the organization's paying for and they don't want to lose that benefit. The worst thing they're going to say is no, but it's worth asking. But again, be balanced and remember, you are making an impression on the employer at this stage. One of the things not to do, don't follow up too much. There is such a thing as following too much post-interview. I would say a maximum of one time a week follow-up. If you haven't heard, I am well aware that there are employers that will ghost people. They will just make it a total black hole. You have no idea what's going on. It is totally fine to follow up, but I'd say keep it up to 1 week. And if you have to make it more frequent, it's because you have something very specific, maybe with your job search, that you need to follow up on. That's time sensitive, like you have another offer, you're really progressing far along and you're really interested in this other opportunity that you just don't know what's going on. Or something urgent, like if you just have a question, that's fine. But I have seen where candidates will just repeatedly follow up, and you kind of have to remember that people have other things going on, that position's not the only thing that they're working on. So I think that covers kind of the core points, Nicole, that we had discussed about negotiations. Does anybody else want to add anything?
I just wanted to second your really good point about bringing PTO to the table in negotiations, because I think that's something a lot of folks don't know that they can do. And it can be a huge boon, because if you're leaving a position where you've got a bank, like it's really daunting to then move into a new position and start from zero, especially if you have caretaking responsibilities. So like you can find out, are there kind of escalator levels at which you can accrue more PTO? Isn't it possible to start at a higher level, or is it possible to start with a bank in place already? And it's really valuable to think about that at that negotiation point. So.
Yeah, thank you to all of our panelists. These were some really great points. I especially appreciate what you were saying, Kate, about sort of not just thinking about negotiating the salary, but sort of all the other benefits that you may want to negotiate before taking on the role. We did get a few questions in the Q&A box, and then there were a few from registrants that we can also go back and touch on that we didn't touch on yet. So I'll start with from the Q&A box. Someone posted, how do you deal with the what is your greatest weakness question, and why do they still ask it? Does anybody want to respond with any input about responding to that question during an interview?
It's truly the worst question because like you're inevitably going to be Michael Scott and being like, my greatest weakness is how awesome I am. It's really challenging. And I think just being honest about, I think a good one is I need to work on delegating responsibilities, or I want to keep working toward communicating my accomplishments better. Something along those lines generally gets the job done. But I agree, we should retire that question.
I will just chime in and say from my own experience, interviewing for things, and also, having people in the past have answered this question, that I do think it's better to try and have there be a grain of truth in what you decide to use as your example. So it may be, working on communicating better, or perhaps being too much of a perfectionist, and sometimes that can slow you down, and needing to sometimes go with, good being better than perfect. But I just think keeping a kernel of something based in reality in how you like to work probably is the best way to go. But hopefully we will be seeing fewer interviewers asking that particular question going forward. See, our next question is, what do you think about asking questions to demonstrate your understanding of the role of the press versus asking questions, real questions, to obtain information you need to better understand the position? So your background research versus the real questions you want to ask in an interview, essentially.
I feel like there is potentially a way to combine them sometimes, like if you use the research that you have done as sort of to say, I understand that I don't know, like the person, I'm like whatever very specific background thing that you've learned. Like I understand that the press is exploring more into this area. Like how do you imagine that will impact the job responsibilities in the future, or will that change things significantly going forward? To kind of like drop in the fact that you have researched and that you do know these things, but still asking the question that you want to ask. And that might take a little bit of finagling sometimes to depending on what your question actually is. But if there is sort of like a subtle way to just be like, oh, this is something that I came across while I was researching, and that made me wonder about XYZ, I think that might be a good way to do it.
Another way to do it is to ask, it just has to do with all of us kind of just getting better at asking questions. Asking questions is hard. It's not straightforward, and there are ways to ask good questions. One of them is to say, here's a question I have, and this is not an open-ended thing for an answer. Is it more like this, or is it more like this? Which of these, and that often will get you a better result, and is another good way to demonstrate your familiarity with whatever it is. But I do really think that you want to ask questions that you want the answers to.
Yeah, and I think if you don't have enough time to blend, or can't figure out a way to blend your knowledge plus learning more about the role, I would prioritize learning about the role. I've seen candidates that are super enthusiastic about the organization, but we are like, are they really clear about the role? Are they even interested in the role? Or are they just interested in working for us? So coming from an HR person, I'm just going to say, if you have to prioritize, focus on the position. We know that that should be really your priority.
One of the questions that we got was how to answer the questions about questions. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Which is something that interviewers frequently ask, and you should have some sense of how you're going to answer that, because there's a likelihood that might actually be on the table when you're in the room. And I think, one way to do this, I would avoid talking about job titles. You just don't really know. You don't know if the person that, the institution or organization you're applying to is planning on elevating this job or has enough room to create yet another senior publicist. And it's I think a more positive way to approach that question is to talk about the kind of work you'd like to do. So rather than saying, I would like to be an acquiring editor, or I want to be acquiring books, to say, I'd like to increase my, I'd like to have, you can mention the department, mention the same publisher or whichever. And I'd really like to have increased responsibilities in these areas, whether it's working more directly or one-on-one with authors, or working more on manuscripts, or helping to shape publicity plans, to keep it focused on the kind of nature of the work that you'd like to do, but in a sort of elevated way. I think that's a more positive way to answer that question.
Okay, and so we have a few more questions. We only have about 8 more minutes, so we'll try and get to as many of them as we can. From the Q&A box, how much weight do volunteer jobs outside of the field count? And how much should one talk about ancillary or outside activities in an interview?
I'll take a stab at that first. So I would focus on where there's transferable knowledge, skills, and abilities. Again, focusing the just how it's related, because if you're just kind of talking about, and if you can't show that connection, that also could raise a bit of a flag. So I think just really being clear and connecting the dots of how that work that might not seem so obvious to the folks that you're talking to, of how it is related, how it is beneficial to the role that you're interviewing for, that would be my suggestion of how to orient it.
Yeah, at Past in Publishing, one of the core things we offer is an opportunity to read through your resume or CV and kind of help focus. And one of the things we most often recommend is trimming volunteer work that's not pertinent to the position, because it can kind of clutter and obfuscate your actual skills that are really pertinent to the work at hand. So we generally also recommend just being really on focus with those volunteer efforts.
And another question we received is, are there good ways to respond to a rejection? So post-interview.
I think definitely. And it's, follow-up, thank you notes, responding to a rejection. These are all just more opportunities to kind of continue the conversation. And if this job didn't work out for you, maybe there will be another one in 4 months or 6 months, to say, to follow up and say, thank you so much. I think the opportunity to send a note saying, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversations I had with the colleagues at this press or this office, and would welcome the opportunity to speak again should there be a fit, a suitable position, something like that, to say that you're still open. And most employers, keep these things on file, and can maybe, if they're able, do a little recruiting the next time. If you went through the whole interview process and you met a lot of people, that's a great opportunity, and it gives you a kind of step up should you apply for another job at that same place. So I think sending thank you notes, responding cordially and professionally to a rejection, those things are important.
Yeah, I would just say also that just a gracious response to a rejection is always a good idea, because I know of several instances where a role, thought we had this really great candidate, but they weren't quite the right fit for this. And then the next time an opening came up, they, the hiring manager, even if they weren't the one hiring, would say, oh, you really should interview this person I interviewed. They were fantastic. So definitely keeping it, just a gracious response, acknowledging that you're still open to hearing from them, I think is a good idea.
That's happened a number of times with us as well. And I just wanted to kind of add that this kind of goes along with what Michelle was talking about earlier about how publishing is a very small world. And you definitely, I mean, I imagine this goes without saying, but you really don't want to burn any bridges. And just seconding what everyone else is saying about keeping it very gracious. And if you're still interested, just making that very clear, because there has definitely been, I know of a couple people that I work with now that originally interviewed for different positions, and then something else opened up down the road. So it can definitely work out later.
And there are, I think, 3 questions still in the Q&A box, but one of those questions is something that also came up a few times in the questions registrants submitted. So I think that's probably a good one for us to touch on. And that is, are there any tips for interviewing for a position / promotion within the organization where you are currently employed? So if anyone has any feedback on things to do or avoid doing in that instance.
So internal candidates, remember, you're internal, so you do have the opportunity to leverage the relationships you already have there. So if you're looking to move departments or just looking for a new opportunity, do leverage the people that are there to talk to and learn and help prepare you for the interviewing process. I think that's the biggest thing that an internal candidate can do.
I think also if there's an area or a department at the press that does really interest you, you don't have to wait until the right position opens up to express an interest in it. And so whether that's approaching your colleague and, as I said before, asking to sit in on a meeting or asking for half an hour to just chat about the work they do, that's a really good way to begin, just to let them know you're interested and you're paying attention. And that way, if a position does open up and you apply, it makes perfect sense. Or maybe they'll reach out to you before that because they know you're interested.
So we are just about at the end of our time for the meeting. So I wanted to say, thank you again to all of our panelists so much for carving out time to talk with everyone today and kind of give some of your thoughts on best practices for handling various aspects of the interview process. Hopefully people who attended were able to gain some helpful insights. And I know we didn't answer every single one of the questions that were submitted because we are running out of time. But you should definitely feel free to look at the Professional Development Committee at AU Presses and also to look at the website for the Paths in Publishing because they both have a lot of additional resources related to both the resumes and cover letters aspect as well as interviewing. And you can also reach out to members of both the Professional Development Committee and Paths in Publishing if you have additional questions, because I'm sure everyone would be happy to provide whatever other helpful resources we might be able to send your way. That's it from us.
Thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you.